Okay. Rabbi, take it away.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. It's nice to see you and to be able to discuss this movie, The Juggler from 1953, starring Kirk Douglas, of course, and directed by Edward Dmytryk. I'll tell you a little bit about the people involved and this production, and then we can talk about the movie itself a bit. It's produced by Stanley Kramer, whose name might be familiar to some of you. We actually watched a movie that he directed in this series a while back, Judgment at Nuremberg from 1961, about the Nuremberg trials and the Nazi war criminals with Maximilian Schell and Judy Garland and some other folks. He was well known as a producer first, then later as a director, and he was kind of the king of the message movies, so that ultimately he directed movies like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner in 1967. But going back to early days of his life, he was born in Hell's Kitchen in New York City. He went to school at NYU. He's from a Jewish family. He graduated NYU when he was only 19 years old in 1933. By 1949, he'd become a pretty big player in Hollywood, and he produced one of the first movies starring Kirk Douglas, a movie where Kirk Douglas plays a boxer called The Champion. The same year, he actually produced a movie called Home of the Brave, which was widely acknowledged as an early champion to fight racism. It's interesting that it's a story about racism directed towards African Americans in the Army, but the story that it was based on was about discrimination against Jews in the Army. Actually, Stanley Kramer changed it to be about African Americans. And a year later, he produced a movie called The Men, which is a very early Marlon Brando movie about disabled war veterans. Pretty remarkable performance by Brando in that movie. He produced High Noon in 1952, which was nominated for an Oscar. Besides High Noon, he was nominated for Best Picture Oscars for The Defiant Ones, which he was both the director and the producer of. It didn't win the Oscar that year. The movie Gigi won. He was also the producer and director, as I mentioned earlier, of Judgment at Nuremberg, which was nominated for an Oscar, lost that year to a juggernaut, West Side Story. So he had some of the bad luck to be up against some movies that are considered to be classics. For instance, his movie Ship of Fools was nominated for Best Picture as well in 1965, lost to The Sound of Music. And so you get the picture here. He was his last nomination was Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. He was nominated for Best Picture and Best Director, and lost both of those. He lost to In the Heat of the Night, won the Best Picture Oscar that year, and Mike Nichols won the Best Director Oscar. So it's but certainly quite a career, and had a lot, a few of his movies over the years had some Jewish content, and some interest to the Jewish community, particularly movies like Judgment at Nuremberg. He did also produce, let me see if I've got that, produced a movie in 1974 called Judgment, The Trial of the Rosenbergs, which I've actually never seen, but another movie that presumably has some Jewish content in it, right? So he was the producer. He hired Edward Dmytryk as the director, and we've seen movies by the very first movie we watched. If any of you have been with us since the very beginning of this class at the height of COVID, we watched a movie called Crossfire, which came out a few months before A Gentleman's Agreement, and is really the first Hollywood movie to talk about anti-Semitism. That was directed by Edward Dmytryk. Dmytryk himself was not Jewish. He's actually born in Canada, I think, of Ukrainian descent. But he did make a few movies over the years that were of interest to our class. He's also the director of the Caine Mutiny, which is just a year after this one, working again with Stanley Kramer. So he made a lot of movies, a lot of B movies in the 1930s. He's one of the pioneers of film noir. And you can actually see there's kind of a film noir characteristic to this film. So it may not be a classic film noir, which are more of the, the Maltese Falcon kind of hard-boiled detective sort of movies. But the kind of the play of light and darkness in this movie, and the cinematography, these are kind of the hallmarks of film noir. In 1944, Dmytryk made Murder My Sweet, which was the character of Philip Marlowe, played by Dick Powell. Leads a lot of people to the debate over and over about who played Philip Marlowe better. Was it Dick Powell or Humphrey Bogart? And each one of these actors has their champions. He became, after that, RKO's leading director and got to do a lot of A-list kind of movies. As it said, he got an Oscar nomination for that movie. We watched the first movie in our series, Crossfire, from 1947. If you remember that, and for those of you who haven't been with us all along the way, I certainly recommend going back and taking a look at the movie Crossfire, but there is a spoiler, so I apologize for that. It's been out since 1947, so can I really be spoiling it? I don't know. But the killer in that movie is an officer in the U.S. Army. And the Army did not take to that portrayal. So it's probably one of the reasons that Edward Dmytryk was one of the Hollywood 10 when the House Un-American Activities Committee decided that Hollywood was subversive. And he was called to testify before the committee. At first, he refused to testify. He went to England instead. Then came back to the United States and actually served some time in prison for contempt of Congress. And to get out of prison, essentially, he agreed to testify in front of the committee. So, and essentially he testified and confirmed the names that the committee already had. So, but it did allow him to go back to work, and starting again about 1952, he made a couple of movies, and then in 1953 he made this movie, and I think was rather happy to be out of the country again, to be able to work with Stanley Kramer and of course the star Kirk Douglas in what, to the best of my knowledge, is certainly the first American studio film to be filmed in Israel. So it's filmed on location. So when it says in things like Haifa, it's actually in Haifa. And so they traveled around to a few different places, which makes it a really interesting primary historic document for what Israel looked like in 1953, less than 5 years after the nation was born. So, so that in itself becomes pretty interesting subtext in the movie, right? So Kirk Douglas was not a stranger to what was going on with the House Un-American Activities Committee. You may know that that Kirk Douglas is given a lot of credit as a producer as well as an actor, and is credited with breaking the blacklist by putting Dalton Trumbo's name on the screenplay on screen for the movie Spartacus in 1961, something like that. So, but so he even as early as 53, he certainly was involved, knew what was going on, and did not have any problem working with Edward Dmytryk, who he worked with on a few occasions, I think. I actually met Edward Dmytryk. I think I've mentioned that a couple of times. When I was applying to rabbinic school, my backup plan, in case I didn't get into rabbinic school, was going to film school at USC. So I actually went to the USC Film School to observe and to sit in on a class. And the class I got to sit in on was a directing class taught by Edward Dmytryk. He was the head of the directing department at USC Film School back in those days, in the 1980s. So a very interesting character. I enjoyed getting the chance to talk to him a little bit that day. So on to Kirk Douglas. Probably doesn't need much introduction to all of you. Some of you may even have read his autobiography, The Ragman's Son, which tells about his Jewish roots. The widely held story of Kirk Douglas is that he kind of came back to Judaism late in his life. But I think it's fair to say, I mean, if you look at movies like this from early in his career, that he was already at least interested in his Jewish roots. He also made another movie, which we watched. I think we paralleled it with the movie Exodus, called Cast a Giant Shadow, where he plays an American Jewish army officer who goes to Israel and becomes a general in Israel's War of Independence. So pretty early on, he was certainly thinking about his own Judaism. And I think in some ways, the character he plays in Cast a Giant Shadow and the character he plays here really have a little bit of his own character in them. I mean, when this character talks about thinking that he was safe from anti-Semitism because he was such a popular, performer as a juggler, I think there's a certain parallel to the rise of power of Kirk Douglas as an actor, so I think he brings a kind of a conviction to the role that comes from his own experience, right? And he says something about didn't even think about the fact that he was Jewish, right? In Nazi Germany, that he was untouchable. And again, I did certain level of sort of interplay between the role of Kirk Douglas as an actor in America and Hollywood, changing his name to Kirk Douglas, and those things that sort of bigger than being just a Jewish American, right? But nevertheless, I think a lot of his choices throughout his life really fit into kind of a Jewish idea of tikkun olam. If you think about some of his early movies and the people he gave help to, I mentioned, of course, Breaking the Blacklist with Dalton Trumbo. That movie was directed by Stanley Kubrick, who also directed Kirk Douglas in an anti-war film from 1957, a very early example of Kubrick's work called Paths of Glory, which is still one of the great anti-war films, I think, of film history. And so you see some of this sense of Kirk Douglas, like Stanley Kramer, who made message movies. Kirk Douglas got a message across here and there as well, right? And so Kirk Douglas was nominated for the Oscar. He'd already been nominated once by the time this movie was made, I think twice by the time this movie was made, now that I think about it. Champion, the boxing movie I mentioned earlier from 1949. He was nominated again for The Bad and the Beautiful in 1952. And then a couple of years after this movie, Lust for Life in 1956. So this movie made in 1953, you can see, is kind of really at the height of his power as an actor. And I think that that's shown in this film. You know, when you think about the other people in this movie, sometimes they look like they're in a different movie than he's in. You know, they're all there, right? But there's just something about the way he burns the screen, you know, with his presence. It's a powerful role, powerfully acted, and you know, not a lot else, right? In a certain sense. You can almost imagine this movie as a one-man show, if you like. But there are a couple of other people who play parts in it. Most of them not likely to be familiar to with you. The female lead, Yael, is played by an actress named Milli Vitale. She's actually Italian. She was 20 years old at the time this movie was made. She doesn't have a lot of other American credits, but she did appear in the Bob Hope movie, The Seven Little Foys. Which is around the same time period. But otherwise, not a lot of appearances in American movies. So, although does that look like she was on the cover of Life magazine there? Is that what I just saw? Oh, Tempo magazine, not the same. So, you might have noticed John Banner in a small part. We've seen him in a couple of other movies as well on our list, including The Young Lions, which was also directed by Edward Dmytryk, which we saw a while back. But John Banner's best known, of course, there he is in the top row as Sergeant Schultz from Hogan's Heroes. Kind of an interesting figure. John Banner was born Jewish in Austria. And in 1938, his theater troupe was appearing in Switzerland when Hitler annexed Austria, and he left for America. So he came to America and often played with his German accent, German characters in a variety of things. So occasionally serious roles. He plays the mayor of the town, a relatively small part in The Young Lions. And here his part, if you noticed, his character's name is Emil Halevi. He's the traveling businessman who gets stuck there because he's actually seen Kirk Douglas's face in after that attack on the policeman. So he ends up sort of dragged around by the police inspector in the search for Kirk Douglas. Okay. The other person you might be wondering about is the young man who plays Josh in the movie, Yehoshua. He's referred to as both Josh and Yehoshua at different times in the movie, depending on who's talking. His name is Joseph Walsh. He goes on to a lot of small parts in a lot of TV series over the years, but he actually had already been in a movie before this one with Danny Kaye, Hans Christian Andersen, the musical version of the Hans Christian Andersen story. So if you looked familiar to you, it's most likely from that. But you see some pictures of him as a grown man, and perhaps you see in some of the various characters that he's played over the years, probably hundreds actually in various TV shows over the decades. The little girl who plays Susie in this movie goes on to play a whole bunch of in practically every TV show. It seems like she's appeared in an episode or so. If there are any big Star Trek fans here, you might recognize her. Her name is Beverly Washburn, and she appears in an episode of the original Star Trek as a young ensign on a mission with Captain Kirk. And there's I think the name of the episode, I think I have somewhere, The Deadly Years, it's called. It's where there's some kind of infection on the planet and everybody's growing old overnight. In the space of an hour, they go from this age to being elderly, right? So those are the folks in the movie, by and large. I mean, there's a couple of other folks who character actors who you've seen in other things, but that's basically the background. So this, as I said, first movie filmed in the state of Israel. The Israeli film industry itself hasn't really gotten started at this point. It's not till the mid-50s that the state of Israel starts to actually make some allocations to kind of create a homegrown film industry. The first Israeli film, most people point to a movie called Hill 24 Doesn't Answer, which I think came out a couple of years after this movie. And the movie that really, I think, put the Israeli film industry sort of on the map is a movie called Salah Shabati, which is about 10 years after this. So it's also one of the first movies really to deal with these questions of what we today might call PTSD, right? The psychological problems of victims of persecution in the Shoah. It wasn't so common to portray things this way. In fact, it took a while before there were really even movies about Holocaust survivors. Right? So this is a pretty early example. It's also probably the first movie that sort of makes any sort of link, I'd say, between, there's this kind of the trauma of the Holocaust and the healing of the land of Israel, right? The old world and the new, how pain can become something else, right? How a person can be transformed. And, we often talk about the miracle of the beginning of the state of Israel. And a lot of times when we say that, we're talking about the miracle of the War of Independence that Israel managed to survive, right? I would say that's not such a miracle, right? Remember that Israel's formed in 1948. The nation of Jordan is formed in 1946. It's not like they had such a big head start on, and in fact, Israel, prior to the founding of the state, already had an army. Remember the Haganah and the Irgun and the Stern Gang and all of these groups. The trick in 1948 was bringing those different militias under one command, but they were already there. And as I said, it's not like they were fighting nations that were so well organized, right? I mean, this has always worked in Israel's favor from a military point of view. I would suggest to you that the real miracle of the founding of the state of Israel is not 1948, but 1949. In 1948, at the time of the armistice, there are 800,000 Jews living in Israel. In 1949, 900,000 Jews moved to Israel. Many of them are displaced people from Europe. The majority of them are actually displaced people coming from the Arab nations that surround Israel, right? Where after the founding of the state of Israel and after the War of Independence, life became untenable in places like Iraq and Syria, Yemen, places like that. So the true miracle is that 800,000 Jews living in the state of Israel absorbed 900,000 immigrants and managed to survive that. I mean, you hear how immigration is such a huge issue in our own democracy, right? I imagine it on that scale, as if, a number equal or exceeding the number of people who actually live here tried to move here. Right? Now, those immigrants were wanted, of course, in Israel, but still, the miracle of resettling 900,000 people is an amazing one, and we see part of that in this movie, this incredible thing of bringing all these people in, and so by 1953, you see a little bit of what the state of Israel looked like in this time period, and this incredible idea of being able to transform all of these immigrants, many of whom are really refugees, right? They're not immigrants, they're people with damage, and they're people who have to leave everything behind when they come to Israel. It's an amazing thing, right? To try and transform those folks into a workforce, a productive place in that period of time. So that's the background for our story, and let's look at the movie itself, right? It's our text. So be interested in hearing what you guys saw and thought about it. I'll just point out a couple of things, and can't say for sure how historically accurate it is, in the sense of, were there really throngs of people at the shore whenever a ship pulled in full of refugees? I'd like to think that's true. I don't know for sure, but that's what we see. But even before we see that in the movie, we see the credits. We see a juggler, right, underneath the credits, and we have to talk about this movie as, yes, he plays a juggler, but obviously that's a symbolic occupation sense, right? Symbolic name. He's also juggling two worlds, right? The one he left behind, the one he's coming to. He's juggling his own sanity, sense, trying to keep the balls in the air, and sometimes one of them falls wrong, right? And so we see some of that, and you may have some other interpretations of what the title might mean, but I didn't even mention the writer, did I? Now that I think about it. So let me just go back for 1 minute and mention that it's written by a Jewish guy named Michael Blankfort from his own novel. He wrote some other screenplays, including the screenplay for Caine Mutiny, and for Halls of Montezuma, if you know that one, a kind of a rousing military movie. He wrote several novels that deal with Jewish themes, and often with a clash of values, right? So you can see some of the other things that he wrote over the years. So we talked about the House Un-American Activities Committee and the Hollywood 10. Michael Blankfort also acted as a front for, and remember, some of us saw that movie as well, The Front, about writers who fronted for other writers. So for one of the Hollywood 10 who was on the blacklist, a guy named Albert Maltz, Michael Blankfort was his front. But that being said, he was a real writer who wrote some of these things on his own. Broken Arrow was a front for Albert Maltz, but things like the Caine Mutiny and this movie, he certainly wrote the screenplays for these. And so we see the ship arrive, we see the refugees come off, we see people greeting them. They board buses and they get taken to an absorption center, right? So, and then if you noticed the things that the bus passes, I think they're highly symbolic, right? An empty cattle car on a railroad siding. I don't think that's an accident. So, what is this character leaving behind when he arrives in Israel? When he gets to the absorption center, it's surrounded by barbed wire, right? And again, we see that barbed wire, a kind of evocation of what he came from. and people there to greet the buses when they arrive. The director, a guy named Rosenberg, greets them and welcomes them to Camp David the King. And, I see Marilyn's got a hand up. I'm not sure if other people do, but let's see if there's some thoughts and questions, and then we'll keep looking at the text of the film.
Yes, I was just going to say, when you were talking about the fact that he's the juggler and he was being juggled, that's mentioned in the critique of the movie. And one of the things I think of is timing. When it's juggling, you have to be so exact with your timing. I was really impressed with his juggling. I think it looks like he was actually doing the juggling. I don't know that there was a stand-in, but what I really wanted to say was he was juggling the timing of the safety for his family. He was juggling that moment when he should have left and didn't. And so that was crucial. That's the whole crux of his juggling.
Yeah.
He made a mistake right there and then, and he had regrets forever.
Right. And so early on, he says, I don't juggle anymore. Right. And I think that's obviously a reaction to what you're talking about, Marilyn, that, how can he go on juggling when he misjuggled the most important thing? Right. So I think that's very much a part of this. And so part of his redemption is the fact that he's able to do a juggling act for the kids, at the kibbutz late in the movie, right? I mean, it's symbolic of his coming back to life, in a sense, after the experience that he had in the old world before he gets into the new. So lovely. And early in the movie, he says a couple of things, the kind of the hard-boiled kind of dialogue that you might expect in a kind of a film noir sort of movie. First of all, it's pretty wrenching when that little girl doesn't want to get off the bus, and she says to her father, "You promised there'd be no more camps." And the Kirk Douglas character says something to her along the lines of, grown-ups are always making promises they can't keep. Right. And then a moment later, says, I was just presenting this young lady with the facts of life. Right. Which, we're starting to get the sort of the telling of his life experience as well, right? The promises that can't be kept, even his own, and so on. I see Mary's hand up.
Yeah. Oh, wait a minute. There you go.
Okay, thank you. Throughout the movie, I saw it as a series of triggers. It was obviously a trigger for the little girl, but Kirk Douglas and his character, the barbed wire, the camps, the police, being contained in a room with no windows. All of those became triggers for him to be violent, be scared, to react.
Yeah.
And so it was just, really heart-wrenching and fascinating to watch what was going to be his next trigger throughout the movie.
Yeah. And we see it very profoundly in that scene in the absorption center check-in, where he sees that woman and family at the window and mistakes them for his dead family in Europe, right?
Right.
Even though he knows, right, his friend has to tell him that don't you remember, they're gone,
right. And he doesn't believe it until he actually takes the scarf from her head to make,
right,
to see the hair color.
Yeah. So you're right, there these triggers, and of course he's triggered very much by anybody in a uniform, not so surprisingly. He's triggered by anyone who asks him questions. The guy who is I think everybody's trying to help, right? And he's just triggered by that, even the guy who's interviewing him at the camp to find out what he did, what his profession is, all that kind of, yeah, maybe he's a little brusque, in the sense of, we don't need a juggler, it's right in a country that's trying to absorb all these immigrants. The juggler is of limited use in a certain sense,
Right.
but
Yeah, even
everybody's trying to learn.
triggers. Yeah,
I'm
even
sorry,
Josh's questions to him
Yeah.
trigger
right,
as well.
yeah.
So,
So, he doesn't want to be reminded of the past. Things do remind him of the past, and of course, the tragic encounter with the police officer, who also is not really, trying to hurt him in any way, realizes when he catches up to him that it's not the guy he's looking for, right? You don't fit the description. Why were you running? And ends up in a near deadly encounter with this police officer, right? That sets in motion his running away completely. And so at which point the movie there's a bit of that film noir police procedural in this movie where we cut back and forth between Kirk Douglas and his getting away along with Josh, and going and intercut with that, of course, is the police inspector trying to find him, right? And so interviewing the people that he's run into along the way, the kids who come in to tell him that they've seen him. There's a few things that go on throughout the movie like that, and so we cut back and forth between them. Other comments? Marilyn?
Yeah, before Marilyn goes, I don't think we can underestimate that this is really the first time they are talking about the Holocaust and the psychological ramifications. And in 2022, we've seen Shoah, we've read book after book after book, but in the early 1950s, this is really, nobody talked about it. And, I give kol hakavod. I mean, that Kirk Douglas made this is really, and that he made it in Israel is really something.
Yeah, in some ways, right? There's a few things in this movie that remind me that we have a way of telling this story now that they didn't have then, for good and bad.
Okay, Marilyn.
Yeah, I was going to say that we don't really see scenes visually of the concentration camp and the actual experience. So we have to rely on his illness and his dialogue and as Mary said, the triggers to understand what he experienced. And so it leaves you with a lot of, I think if a Jewish person is watching this, perhaps they would understand a little quicker than somebody who wasn't as familiar with the concentration camps. I don't know. I think everybody at this point is pretty much informed with how the world was then, but I find that to be interesting in that they don't show any of the concentration camps in itself. There's no prelogue about what his life was really like visually.
Right, no flashbacks other than we see him on screen having a flashback, but we don't see what he sees.
Right.
And it was a while after the war before those images became really commonplace for people, that they really saw them. There may be some people on here who can remember when they first saw them. I know that when the actors were making Judgment at Nuremberg, which is not till almost 10 years later, right? That the director, who's the producer of this movie, Stanley Kramer, showed them. William Shatner wrote about this, actually, who, if you remember, is in that movie Judgment to Nuremberg. That when they got to Nuremberg to make that movie, Kramer showed them the documentary evidence of the liberation of the concentration camps, the piles of bodies that were left over, the emaciated victims. I mean, those kinds of things. And it changed the demeanor, Shatner says, of the whole cast, having seen that stuff for the first time, recognizing the importance of the movie that they were making, right? So that's almost 10 years later than this. And, those films were not sort of a commonplace that they become a little later in time, right? So, so that's part of what I mean about, we are more steeped in this story than the people who watched the movie then would have been. And we also, both in terms of the birth of the state of Israel and the way we tell the story of the Holocaust, we have our official story, which didn't yet exist, I don't think, in the same way there. I mean, I'm sort of interested by this exploration of a bombed out Palestinian village and this sort of strange time period where there are Syrian patrols riding around, in northern kibbutz, where borders aren't really clear, and so it's kind of an interesting time capsule in that sense as well, right?
Okay, so we have Sandy, Elaine, and John said, Rabbi, can you?
Lori also.
Oh, okay. And Lori.
Yeah.
And John said, can Rabbi I comment on the choice of limited use of Hebrew words in the film? And they were American accents, indeed. Okay,
Yeah.
Sandy, go ahead.
Well, let me just say something. Well, this movie is made for an American audience. It's not made for, to be released anywhere but here. So if the writer knew any more Hebrew than he uses, I have no idea. But frankly, for an American like me, I like it when they go slow. That's so there isn't a word in Hebrew that I miss in this movie, which is nice. It's made by Columbia Pictures, right? It was made for the American audience. I'm not sure who said it, that it's what would non-Jews looking at this movie have known and thought when they saw it? I think honestly that it explains why it's a bit obscure. I mean, this one reason why we couldn't find it on Amazon. I'm glad somebody put it up on YouTube, right? Because it's not that easy to find. I don't think it's ever been released on a regular DVD. I'm not sure about that, but certainly I never ran into it that way. It sort of gets lost in the shuffle of great Kirk Douglas performances because it's not, probably not that accessible to those who don't already bring something to it. It does feel, even to me, like a lot of the movie is a little bit truncated. It feels like there's missing pieces, but there's just enough for it to hold together kind of coherently in an hour and 20 minutes, So who's next?
Sandy.
I knew that I had seen this years ago, possibly in Israel, because we used to have a kibbutz next to us that one of the kibbutznikim used to sneak us in on Friday night and let us see movies, which was a big thrill to us. And they liked American films, but I really enjoyed watching it all over again. And I think we as Jews like to see the history of Israel over and over again. It never gets boring. So seeing the kibbutz, seeing the dancing, it's just, I don't know, the history of Israel is just so beautiful to us. So I did enjoy that. I loved everything about the film except the music. It was awful.
Yeah, it's actually a well-known composer. I'll have to look it up and see who it was, but it is a bit bombastic, I'd say. It hits you over the head a little bit.
Yes.
But the folk dancing moment and the line that he says something about I won't be able to quote it directly, but something along the lines of it's as if we'd been dancing together always, right? That these people from all different places, very quickly become the dance troupe together. That's the composer, Vanessa?
Yeah, this is the composer. I thought so I looked him up.
Okay, great. So yeah, he's actually he's written some other stuff that's pretty well known, but a certain kind of music, we'll say. But he did. I just noticed he actually worked with Hedy Lamarr on this technological device that becomes, I think, is it radar? Something like that. So so he was involved in the production of that thing, which ultimately becomes an amazing invention, which ultimately gives rise to the internet. So we wouldn't be here today without Hedy Lamarr and George Antle.
Okay. Elaine, go ahead.
Yeah, there's several scenes where they show the number tattooed on his arm.
Yes.
And so the people in the movie who see that realize he's been through something traumatic. I wonder if that doesn't help them deal with him and his behavior.
I think it definitely does. And of course, it also becomes, that's how they know he's lying about being an American, right?
Yeah,
See that number on his arm, then it gives him away too.
Yeah.
So it does both. It allows them to perhaps, instead of looking for him to shoot him down for attacking a policeman, they're looking for him to help him, right? So
at one point he says, I lost my mother, my wife and my children in the Holocaust. Does he say that to the little boy? I think
to Yael ultimately, right? I mean, it's when he and Yael are holed up for a moment in that bombed out village, and he looks in there's a little doorway, and he says, imagine a place like that, half the size of that. And, that's where I was. And not alone, with 10 other people, I think, right? And tells her about the loss of his family. By the way, let's not discount the end of the movie. That what is the ending is his coming to terms with what everybody has said about him and for him all through the movie. He says, help me, right? I need help. And so
he keeps telling everyone, I'm an American. And then Yael sees the numbers,
right.
And that's just a giveaway. Right.
But I was making the point that, all through the movie he's saying, I don't need help. I'm okay. It's in that final cathartic moment when he says, I do need help, right? That there's the possibility of his healing. Right. Lori's been waiting patiently a long time. Sorry.
So I appreciate your telling us about this surge of immigration in 49 and many of them from Arabic countries. But Jim and I were both wondering, he's come from Germany, obviously, in 49. What happened to people who were in camps like that for 4 or 5 years before they could immigrate to Israel? Where would he have been?
They were in displaced person camps in different parts of Europe. I mean, some in Poland, and some in places like Cyprus. It's been a while since I've read up on that, but throughout Europe, there were these DP camps. Some people got out of those DP camps and went wherever they went. Some went back to the places they came from, but a lot didn't have any place to go back to, couldn't convince anyone to let them go back to those places, didn't want to go back to those places. And so ultimately in 1949, it's one of the reasons frankly, it is one of the reasons why the UN was interested in the partition plan in 1947, was the question of what to do with these refugees, the scattered remnant stuck in these DP camps in parts of Europe.
There were big DP camps in Italy. And I know many Holocaust survivors who came through Rome and, the survivors I know, they got married there. I mean, they were trying to go on with their lives, and it was terrible.
Yeah, it's it's something we can barely even imagine, right? So going from a concentration camp into a displaced persons camp, right? Which was better, but not normal, and just that there are people who somehow managed to get through all of that relatively unscathed, and there were others, most people were scarred for life in some way or another. It may or may not have made them unproductive. Think of an Elie Wiesel, who's unbelievably productive, but also absolutely scarred, right? And some of the ones that strike me as, Primo Levi, right? Again, incredibly productive, writing very meaningful work, and then committing suicide 50 years later, right? It's impossible for us to really gauge that level of trauma that these folks went through. But so a lot of these folks sat in these displaced person camps from the liberation of the camps in 1944 until they could go to Israel in 1948. A few were absorbed into other parts of the world, but the US and other places retained their quota on how many people they were going to let in. So people were left to languish in these places for several years.
Elaine said the pawnbrokers from 1964. And again, this is 10 years earlier. And I had one other thing. It'll come
When we
back.
watched The Pawnbroker in this class.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah.
And I said then, stick by it, that there probably has not been a better movie made about the Shoah and what it means in people's lives, right?
Right. Oh, and the other writer,
Implications of it, of the Shoah. I mean, it's a brilliant movie.
Jerzy Kaczynski, who wrote The Painted Bird, another Holocaust survivor who committed suicide.
Yeah.
And
He also wrote Being There, if you remember.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he wrote Being There, the movie with the Jewish actor I don't think we've had a chance to see in any of our movies yet, Peter Sellers.
Ooh, did not know he was Jewish. Okay.
Absolutely.
Pink Panther Marathon. Okay. Marilyn.
I was going to say, it was so reminding me of the holidays, when we know that we have to have a lending hand. Sometimes you can help yourself and sometimes you can't. I remember hearing a lecture by Rabbi Sachs, and he said, you can't get yourself out of jail. You need somebody to, there's certain situations you can't do yourself. And so it's our job to lend a leading hand. And so the beautiful young woman in the movie, he says that things are hopeless, and he says, and she says, I'll never blame you. And then I wrote these words down because I thought it was so beautiful. He said, what can I promise you? And she said, I'll take the chance. And so I think that the people along the way helped him finally put the gun down and realize that there is a better way, but without other human beings. And as Rabbi Sachs says, it's not a world of I, it's a world of we, and we have to reach out and help one another. And this was a perfect example in this situation of a beautiful love affair at the very end.
Yeah, and yeah, I don't as much as the movie tries to wrap this up in sort of a neat bundle at the end, right? I mean, you still have to recognize that that's the moment where he recognizes that there's something wrong with him. That's the beginning of the work, right?
Yes, it's a long road ahead of him.
Yeah, and earlier in the movie, someone says to him, when you can admit you're sick, that's the first sign of health, right?
Right.
And so that comes back at the end of the movie. But his response at that point is, well, who's sick and who's well, right? And I think there's that grayness there that's worth thinking about, what's I don't know who said it, in an insane society, the sane person will appear insane, right? It's hard to define, right, who's sick and who's well sometimes, right? It's a very gray kind of place that we and that's one of the things about film noir, right, is this sort of recognition that the human condition is not so easily defined as good guys wear white hats and bad guys wear black hats, and that's the way it is, right? So is his character a good guy or a bad guy, right? I mean, he nearly kills a policeman, right? He accosts a woman in the absorption center, right? He yells at people. I mean, he's not a nice man in a lot of ways, and yet he has all these other, first of all, the mitigating factors, but also redeeming features. The way he teaches Joshua to juggle, and is attentive to him in the hospital, and those kinds of things, so that we have a kind of a more complicated moral world being painted in this picture than was regularly portrayed in Hollywood movies. So in that sense, it's definitely a film noir. It's a really interesting example of it. We're about to the end of our time. I hope.
Yes, we are.
I hope you like it.
And I would be remiss if I did not have a few announcements here. One is this Sunday is Cantor O'Brien and Susan Benjamin, Hallelujah, Leonard Cohen and friends. Please come at 9:30 to eat your lox and bagels. We'll be in the sanctuary. It's going to be delicious. Elaine, I don't know if there'll be a pumpernickel. I'm not there, so I try to get you the pumpernickel. And then in the afternoon, after you've calmed down with Leonard Cohen, you can go to the candidates forum. And I'm not exactly sure what you'll be feeling after that. Hopefully hopeful. And Friday night is Tikkun Olam Shabbat. Somebody from CASA will be there, and we are collecting underwear and socks for all ages. And tomorrow is Thursday. Rabbi Mafik will be doing the Jewish Supreme Court justices. And report everything. If you miss something, I'm sorry.
I was just going to remind everyone 2 weeks to watch the next movie, because we'll meet 2 weeks from today.
Right. Thank you.
So the movie is Defiance, and it's got Daniel Craig in it. And one of the reasons I paralleled these two, and you'll find other parallels as well, is the kind of actor Kirk Douglas is and the kind of actor that Daniel Craig is make for a fascinating comparison just on the surface of that. The story of the Bielski brothers in the forests of Poland during World War II. So an interesting counterpoint to this movie, I think.
Kirk Douglas was really at the height of his stardom, and it was just so, it was a beautiful movie. It was a beautiful movie today.
Yeah.
As always, if you have any questions, you can email me. I'm happy to.
We could go on and on about this one too, right?
Yes, we could.
It's interesting. It's Haifa and Nazareth.
Right. I didn't even think about that.
Go to, right? But in 1953, Haifa and Nazareth were a lot bigger deal than either of them is now, I'd say.
Yeah.
But when we go to Israel, we go to Tel Aviv and we go to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Tel Aviv wasn't what Tel Aviv is now in 1950.
No, and you didn't go, I don't think the Christian tours go to Nazareth. We do not go to Nazareth. And yeah, I mean, watching all of that, the Syrians on horseback, again, we could keep going, but
There's
we're-
apparently a scene
oh.
on the cutting room floor where they interact with the
yeah.
series, but
What's the year of this? Because there's two movies, and the year of the one we're supposed to watch is
well, it's the one with Daniel Craig. So if you look
okay.
for that, you'll find it. But let me
It's on the flyer. That's what 2008. Thank you, Elaine. Very quick Googling. Okay. So be sure to watch that one.
Will Cantor's program be live streamed?
Yes. Mhm.
Sunday
Will it be
morning comes out.
zoomed? Will it be
Yeah.
zoomed?
No, it's going to be live streaming from the sanctuary, and it's not being recorded. So
So you have to watch it live, but it will
you have
be
to watch it live. And we have another program on November 6th, also live streamed, but not recorded.
Yeah.
So, okay.
great. Good to see
Good to
everybody.
see everyone. Be well. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.